Welcome, Warhammer fans. Today I'll be reading about the feeble but mighty Necron tier and the war in heaven. The Necron tier are the predecessor to the Necron, back when they still had a mortal coil, which I covered in the last video linked here. Before we start the lore, who's that Warhammer character? He turned on the warriors of his own legion at the Battle of Scalathrax. P.S. I'm reading off the Warhammer wiki for the Necrons. Link is in the description. Starting out with a little bit of background on the Necron tier, the humanoid species that would become the Necrons began their existence under a fearsome, scourging star in the far reaches of the galaxy, known as the Halo Stars region. Billions of standard years before humanity evolved on old Earth, assailed at every moment by solar winds and intense radiation storms. The flesh and blood species, known as the Necron tier, became a morbid people whose precarious lifespans were riven by constant loss. What little information the Imperium of Man has recovered on the Necron tier tells that their lives were short and uncertain, their bodies blighted and consumed at an early age by the terrible cancers and other illnesses linked to the high levels of ionizing radiation given off by their sun. Necron tier cities were built in anticipation of their inhabitants' early demise, as the living were only brief residents scratching their daily livelihoods in the shadow of the vast sepulchres and tombs of the ancestors, of their ancestors, excuse me. Likewise, their ruling dynasties were founded on the anticipation of an early death, and the living were thought of as no more than temporary residents hurrying through the more permanent and lasting structures raised to honor the dead. On the Necron tier homeworld, the greatest monuments were always built for the dead, never the living. And that's one reason I like the Necron, or at least the Necron tier, is because they're basically emo kids, but with a pretty good reason to be emo. Driven by necessity, the Necron tier escaped their crucible prison and struck out for the stars, hopeful of carving out an empire in which they could realize their species' freedom from the lethal energies of their birth star, using stasis crypts and slow-moving antimatter-powered torch ships that were clad in the living metal known as necrodermis. Still makes me laugh. To resist the millennia-long journeys through the void, the Necron tier began to colonize distant worlds. Little by little, the Necron tier dynasties spread ever further, until much of the ancient galaxy answered to their rule. From the earliest days, the rulers of individual Necron tier dynasties were themselves governed by the Triarch, a council composed of 3 Necron dynasty monarchs known as the Pharaons. The head of the Triarch was known as the Silent King, for he addressed his subjects only through the other 2 Pharaons who ruled alongside him. Nominally, a hereditary position, the uncertain lifespans of the Necron tier ensured that the title of Silent King nonetheless passed from one royal dynasty to another many times. The final days of the Necron tier empire occurred during the reigns of the Caesarcan dynasty, the last of the Silent Kings. Sometime during their slow interstellar expansion, the Necron tier encountered an ancient species far older than any other in existence in the known galaxy. These beings were the Old Ones, and they were absolute masters of forms of energy the Necron tier could not even conceive of, yet alone wield. The Old Ones had long ago conquered the secrets of immortality, yet they refused to share the gift of eternal life with the Necron tier, who yet bore the genetic curse of the bitter star they had been born under. The colonization of much of the galaxy by the reptilian mystics had been immeasurably swifter and more expansive than that of the Necron tier because of their warp gates and mastery of the Immaterium. That and the Old Ones' incredibly long, if not downright immortal lifespans, kindled a burning jealous rage in the Necron tier, which aided their culture spiritually as much as physical cancers consumed their bodies. The Necron tier were astonished to learn that another intelligent species enjoyed such long lives while their own were cut so brutally short. But as time wore on, further strife came to the Necron tier. Each dynasty sought to claim its own destiny, and soon the great houses were engaged in an all-out conflicts known as the Wars of Secession. Had circumstances remained as they were for but just a generation more, it is possible that the Necron tier would have wiped themselves out, as so many species had done before them, and shall do in the future. As their territory grew ever wider and more diverse, the unity that had made them strong was eroded, and bitter wars were waged as entire realms fought to win independence. Ultimately, the Triarch realized that the only hope of unity for their people lay in conflict with an external enemy, but there were few who could prove a credible threat to the technologically advanced Necron tier. Only the Old Ones were a prospective foe powerful enough to bid the feuding Necron tier dynasties to a common cause. Such a war was simplicity itself to justify, for the Necron tier had ever rankled at the Old Ones' refusal to share the secrets of eternal life. I can understand why they would be pissed, especially if they're like, homies and, I don't know, giving each other sun juice. I don't know why the wiki is using the word rankled, though. Rankled. What is rankled? I have never heard that before. The Necron tier had ever rankled at the Old One's refusal. Okay, anyways. Good stuff, good stuff. We are just about at the War in Heaven. So it was the silent kings of the Caesarcan dynasty. Maybe it's just Sarkin, in a typically bitter act of jealousy and resentment for the Necron tier species, declared war on the Old Ones. At the same time, he offered amnesty to any secessionist Necron tier dynasties who willingly returned to the fold of the Triarch, thus lured by the spoils of victory and promise of immortality. The separatist Necron tier realms abandoned their wars of secession, and what was later known as the War in Heaven began. A conflict unlike any fought before erupted across the stars. Yet while the Silent King and the Triarch had succeeded in uniting their hateful people, it was a war the Necron tier could not win, not on their own. The War in Heaven. The terrible wars between the Old Ones and the Necron tier that followed, known later in Aldari myth as the War in Heaven, would fill a library in their own right. But the Necron tier could never win. Their superior technology was consistently outmaneuvered by the Old Ones thanks to their mastery of the webway portals and warp gates. The Necron tier were pushed back until they were little more than an irritation to the Old Ones' dominance of the galaxy, a quiescent threat clinging to their irradiated world among the halo stars. Exiled and forgotten, the Necron tier's fury was cooled by their long millennia of imprisonment on their homeworld, slowly transforming into an utter hatred towards all other forms of intelligent life, and an implacable determination to avenge themselves upon their seemingly invincible enemies. But in the face of defeat, the always fragile unity of the Necron tier began to fracture once more. No longer did the prospect of a common enemy have any hold over the desperate dynasties. Scores of generations had now lived and died in the service of an unwinnable war, and many Necron tier dynasties would have gladly sued for peace. Would have gladly sewed for peace? Gladly sued, that's what it says. Gladly sued for peace with the Old Ones if the ruling Triarch had permitted it. Thus began the second iteration of the Wars of Secession. Here we go again, more widespread and ruinous than any that had come before. So fractured had the Necron tier dynasties become by then that, had the Old Ones been so inclined, they could have wiped out their foes with ease. Faced with the total collapse of their rule, the Triarch searched desperately for a means of restoring order. In this, their prayers were answered, though the price of their species would be incalculably high. It was during the reign of the Caesarcan dynasty's silent kings that the godlike energy beings known as the Catan first blighted the Necron tier. It is impossible to say for certain how the Necron tier first made contact with the Catan, though many misleading, contradictory, and one-sided accounts of these events exist. The dusty archives of the tomb world of Solomence claim it was but an accident, a chance discovery made by a stellar probe during the investigation of a dying star. The Book of Mournful Night, held under close guard in the Eldari Black Library's innermost sanctum, tells rather that the raw hatred that the Necron tier held as a species for the Old Ones sang out across space, acting as a beacon that the Catan could not ignore. Another account claims that from the earliest days of their civilization, Necron tier scientists had been deeply engaged in stellar studies to try to understand and protect themselves from their own sun's baleful energies. After long, bitter centuries of searching for some power to unleash upon the Old Ones, the Necron tier researchers used stellar probes to discover unusual electrodynamic anomalies in the oldest dying stars of the galaxy. In the complex skeins of the energy, in the complex skeins, I don't know what word that is, Skeins, skeins? Of the energetic plasma of these suns, the Necron tier found an intelligence that was more ancient than that of any of the corporeal species in creation, including the Old Ones. Whoa, the Catan. Entities of pure energy that had spawned during the birth of the stars eons ago. These entities had little conception of what the rest of the universe entailed when the Necron tier first found them, feeding upon the solar flares and magnetic storms of these bloated red giants. Here was the weapon the Necron tier had long sought to bring about the downfall of the Old Ones, beings they believed were beings they believed were the progeny of the death god they had long worshipped. Howsoever first contact occurred, the shadow of the Catan fell over the oldest Necron tier dynasties first. The power of these star-born creatures was incredible. The raw energy of the stars made animate, and the Necron tier called them the Catan or star gods in their own tongue. The Catan were dispersed across areas larger than whole planets, their consciousness too vast for humanoids to comprehend. However the Necron tier ever managed to communicate with them is unknown to the Adeptus Mechanicus, understanding that such diffuse minds could never perceive the material universe without manifesting themselves in a material form. Some Necron tier actively sought the Catan's favor and oversaw the forging of physical shells for the Catan to occupy, cast from the living metal called the necrodermis that they had once used for their colony's torch ships. Fragmentary Aldari legends tell of a translucent streamers of electromagnetic force shifting across space as the star vampires coiled into their new bodies in the physical realm across an incorporeal bridge of starlight. Thus clad, the Catan took the physical shapes of the Necron tier half-forgotten gods, hiding their own true desires beneath cloaks of These are so many big words. Hiding their own true desires beneath cloaks of obsequiescence. Obsequious, that's it, okay. Beneath cloaks of obsequious subservience. Boy, that whole paragraph just, took my brain and threw it for a loop. I'm dizzy after that. Genuinely, I'm standing while reading this stuff and my head kinda hurts. I'm taking 5. Incomprehensible forces were compressed into the living metal of the necrodermis bodies, which the Necron tier had forged as the full power of the Catan at last found form. As the Catan focused their consciousness and became ever more aware of their new mode of existence, they came to appreciate the pleasures available to beings of matter and the other realities of corporeal life. This seems just like bad wording, but alright. The deliciously focused trickles of electromagnetic energy given off by the physical bodies of the Necrontyr all about them awakened a new hunger in the Catan, very unlike the one they had once sated using the nourishing, but essentially tasteless energies of the stars. So it was that one of the Catan came before the silent king Cesaric, the last of his line, acting as the forerunner to the coming of his brothers. Amongst his own kind, this Catan was known as Mephetron, the deceiver, for he was willfully treacherous. For he was willfully treacherous. For he was willfully treacherous. Treacherous? Treacherous. I'm having tough with. I need 5 again. So it was that one of the Catan came before the silent king Cesaric, the last of his line, acting as forerunner to the coming of his brothers. Pause. Amongst his own kind, this Catan was known as Mephetron, the deceiver, for he was willfully treacherous. Yet the silent king did not know this Catan's true nature, and instead granted the creature an audience. The deceiver spoke of a war, fought long before the birth of the Necrontyr, between the Catan and the Old Ones. It was a war, he said, that the Catan had lost. In the aftermath, and fearing the vengeance of the Old Ones, he and his brothers had hidden themselves away, hoping one day to find allies with whom they could finally bring the Old Ones to account. In return for this aid, the deceiver assured, he and his brothers would deliver everything that the Necrontyr craved. Unity could be theirs once again, and the immortality that they had sought for so long would finally be within their grasp. No price would there be for these great gifts, the deceiver insisted, but they were but boons to be bestowed upon valued allies. So they're promising eternal life if the Necrontyr go to war with the Catan against the Old Ones. Interesting. Thus did the deceiver speak, and who can say how much of his tale was truth? It is doubtful whether even the deceiver knew, for trickery had become so much a part of his existence that even the Catan could no longer divine its root. Yet his words held sway over the silent king who, like his ancestors before him, despaired of the divisions that were once again tearing his people apart. For long solar months he debated the matter with the other 2 pharaohs of the Triarch and the nobles of his royal court. Through it all, the only dissenting voice was that of Oricon, the court astrologer of the Triarch, who foretold that the alliance between the Necrontyr and the Catan would bring about a renaissance of glory, but destroy forever the soul of the Necrontyr people. Yet desired ambition swiftly overrode caution, and Oricon's prophecy was dismissed. They should have listened to that guy, I have a feeling. A Necrontyr year after the deceiver had presented his proposition, the Triarch agreed to the alliance, and so forever doomed their species. How? Okay, immortality is a double-edged sword, a monkey's paw of sorts. For their part, the Necrontyr soon fell into awe of their discoveries, and the Catan moved to take control over their benefactors. The power of the Catan manifested in the physical world were indeed almost godlike, and it was not long before the Catan were being worshipped as the star gods the Necrontyr had named them. Perhaps they had been tainted by the material universe they had become a part of, or perhaps this had always been their nature, even when they were bound in the suns they fed upon. But the Catan proved to be as cruel and capricious as the stars from which they had been born. They soon reveled in the religious worship of the Necrontyr and feasted upon the electromagnetic life energies of countless mortal slaves. armed with weapons of godlike power and starships that could cross the galaxy in the blink of an eye through the use of quantum phase technology. The Necron tier stood ready to begin their war against the Old Ones anew. But the Catan had another gift for their mortal subjects. They offered the Necron tier a path to immortality and the physical stability their species had always craved. Their diseased flesh would be replaced with the living metal of necrodermis that made up their star god's own physical forms. Their discarded organic husks would be consumed, and their cold metal forms would then be free to pursue their great vengeance against the Old Ones and the rest of a hateful universe, freed forever from the weakness of their hated flesh. Uh, that was interesting wording. Their discarded organic husks would be consumed. With the pact between Necron Tyr and Catan sealed, the Star Gods revealed the form that immortality would take for the Necron Tyr, and the great biotransference process began. Vast biofoundries were constructed, and into these the Silent King Sasarkin's people marched according to the terms of their pact he had made with the Catan. What blasphemous procedures the Necrontyr were subjected to within the raging bio-furnaces cannot be known, but certainly each was stripped of flesh and soul, their body replaced by a shell of living metal almost said it, necrodermis, much like the Catan themselves, animated by what remained of their guttering self. Above each furnace swooped and dove the ethereal true forms of the Catan as they glutted themselves on the spiritual and electromagnetic detritus of an entire species. It was only when the Silent King himself emerged from the biotransference process and looked upon what had become of his people that he saw the awful truth of the pact he had made. Though immortality and nigh godlike strength and vigor were his, it had come at the cost of his soul. The aethic remains of which had already been sucked down through the gullet of the circling Catan. Ooh, that hits in your soul. I mean, literally, but it kind of gave me a little pit in my stomach. As Cesaric watched the Catan feast on the life essence of his people, he realized the terrible depths of his mistake. In many ways, he felt better than he had in Necrontyr decades. The countless aches and uncertainties of organic life now behind him, his new machine body was far mightier from the frail form he had tolerated for so long, and his thoughts were swifter and cleaner than they had ever been. I just had a realization. In the Necrontyr society, there is revelry for death. Life is short, death is eternal, so they must have respect for the soul. And the fact that their souls were just taken from them hits on two levels. One, I'm sure not having a soul doesn't feel too good, but second, they're separated from their ancestors forever. Okay, let's move on. Yet there was a terrible emptiness gnawing at his mind, an inexpressible hollowness of spirit that defied rational explanation. In that moment he knew with cold certainty that the price of physical immortality had been the loss of his soul. With great sorrow, the Silent King beheld the fate he had brought upon his people. The Necrontyr were now but a memory, and the soulless, undying Necrons had been reborn in their place. Yet if the price had been steep, biotransference had fulfilled all of the promises the Catan had made. Even the lowliest of the Necrontyr was now blessed with immortality. Age and hard ionizing radiation could little erode their new mechanical bodies, and only the most terrible of injuries could destroy them utterly. The biotransference process had embedded engrammatic command protocols in every Necron mind, granting Sarek the unswerving loyalty of his subjects. At first, the Silent King embraced this unanimity, for it was a welcome reprieve from the chaos and fractiousness that had consumed the Necrontyr Empire in recent years. The entire species was now his to command, and so it fell upon the Necrons to honor their side of the terrible bargain. However, as time wore on, Cesaric grew weary of his burden, but dared not sever the command protocols, lest his subjects turn on him seeking vengeance for the terrible curse he had visited upon them. Biotransference had left behind only the ghostly echoes of the Necrontyr's consciousness. Only a few of the most strong-willed Necrontyr among the nobility and the military retained their intellect and self-awareness. And even they were but shadows of their former selves. They had been purged of so much of what had made them unique individuals. But unlike the Silent King, most of the Necrons at first cared not at all for their loss. Wow, that's surprising. Most people didn't care about losing their soul. Okay, I was wrong about the culture thing. All that mattered to them was that they would live forever without disease or death as their star gods had promised. Renewed and empowered as never before by the devouring of the souls of an entire species, the Catan were now unstoppable, and with the undying legions of the Necrons marching in their wake, the Old Ones were doomed. Only one thing truly remained of the old Necrontyr, their burning hatred for all the other living intelligent species in the universe. Legions of the undying living metal warriors set out in the galaxy in their tomb ships, and the stars burned in their wake. The Old One's mastery of the warp was now countered by the Catan's supremacy over the physical universe, and the ancient enemies of the Necrons suffered greatly in the interstellar slaughter that followed.
Who's that?
Warhammer character, Karn the Betrayer. Karn is the greatest mortal champion of Khorne, the Blood God, and one of the deadliest killers in the galaxy. With the Catan and the Necrons fighting as one, the Old Ones were now doomed to defeat. Glutted on the life force of the Necrontyr, the empowered Catan were able to unleash forces beyond comprehension. Planets were razed, suns extinguished, and whole star systems devoured by black holes called into being by the reality warping powers of the star gods. Necron legions finally breached the webway and assailed the Old Ones in every corner of the galaxy. They brought under siege the fortresses of the Old Ones' many allies amongst the younger intelligent species of the galaxy, harvesting the life forces of their defenders. Harvesting the life forces of the defenders to feed their voracious Catan masters. In the closing years of the War in Heaven, one of the primary factors that led to the Necrons' ascendancy was their ability to finally gain access to the Old One's webway. The Catan, known as the Nyadrazeth, the Burning One. How did I say that good the first try, and then I screw up the Burning One? Had long desired to carry his eldritch fires into that space beyond space, and so showed the Necrons how to breach its extra-dimensional boundaries through a series of living stone portals known as the Dolmen Gates. The Necron were finally able to turn the Old One's greatest weapon against them, vastly accelerating the ultimate end of the War in Heaven. So a Dolmen Gate. Let's just read a little bit about a Dolmen Gate. A Dolmen Gate is a living stone portal that serves as a gate into a portion of the webway created by the Old Ones. Dolmen Gate technology was first developed by the Necrons, with the aid of the Catan Nyadrazatha, the Burning One. With this technology, I thought it was Nyadrazeth, but this says something else. Alright. I think they're the same person. With this technology, the Necrons were able to gain a major advantage during the War in Heaven, and were finally able to move rapidly through interstellar space without relying on sublight, antimatter-powered stasis ships. As a species lacking psychers, the dolmen gates now represent the only means the Necrons possess for faster-than-light interstellar space travel. By the time of the 41st millennium, most of the dolmen gates still scattered around the galaxy have been destroyed by the Aldari, or have malfunctioned over the passage of time. Those few still functioning have allowed certain Necron dynasties to exert their influence rapidly over a large area. Most notably, the Necrons that arose from the world of Damnos utilized dolmen gates to the maximum effect, and launched raiding parties all over the ultimate segmentum. We're not going to learn what about the Ultima segmentum, but okay, so dolmen gates are just portals. They look like pretty cool rune, like coffin portals. I wonder how big they are. Is it like individual Necron have to go in one by one, and it's just a massive line of people waiting to get through? Or is it a giant? Is the dolmen gate a giant thing? I hope it's giant. The portals offered by the dolmen gates are neither so stable nor so controllable as the naturally occurring entrances to the webway scattered across the galaxy. Indeed, in some curious fashion, the webway can detect when its environs have been breached by a dolmen gate. Wow, okay. And its arcane mechanism swiftly attempt to seal off the infected spur from the rest of the labyrinth dimension until the danger to its integrity has passed. Thus, Necron entering the webway must reach their intended destination through its shifting extra-dimensional corridors quickly, lest the network itself bring about their destruction. Of course, in the present age, aeons have aeons? Aeons have passed. Eons. That's how you spell that word? Eons have passed since the Necron used the dolmen gates to assault their archenemies. The old ones are gone, and the webway itself has become a tangled and broken labyrinth. Many dolmen gates were lost or abandoned during the time of the Necrons' Great Sleep, and many more were destroyed by the Aldari, the Old One's successors as the guardians of the webway. Those that remain grant access to but a small portion of the immense maze that is the webway, much of that voluntarily sealed off by the Aldari to prevent further contamination. Wow, wow, wow. That was a whole lot of information. I don't know anything about the Aldari, but when I played Dawn of War, I mean, they always kind of seemed like the dainty elves, but I loved their design. Their character designs were awesome. And they're the successors to the old ones? Were the old ones like straight up allies with the Aldari? We'll find that out later. There's just so much information going on. I can't just keep stopping to look into things. I'm gonna keep going on the war in heaven, but golly, this is some good lore. Yet the webway is immeasurably vast, and even these sundered skeins allow the Necrons a mode of travel that far outpaces those of the younger races. It is well that this is so. As a species bereft of psychers, and as a result of their lost souls during the biotransference process, the Necrons are also incapable of warp travel, and without access to the webway, they would be forced to rely once more on slow voyaging stasis ships, dooming them to interstellar isolation. The Necrons are incapable of warp travel. Long live the Emperor. That's why we love him. He's a good man. Okay, so Necron are really getting nerfed now. For unknown reasons, but probably because their individual hungers for mortal life energies knew no bounds. The Catan ultimately began to fight amongst themselves for both sport and out of spite. Really? They seemed smarter than that, but okay. Among the Aldari, an ancient myth holds that their laughing god tricked the Catan known as the Outsider into turning on its brothers and beginning their long war for ascendancy. Interesting. I wonder if any of that Aldari ancient myth is true or not. In the course of the Cataan's struggle against one another, whole planets were razed, stars were extinguished, and entire solar systems were devoured by unleashed black holes. New cities were built by the efforts of millions and then smashed down once more. As the red harvests of the Catan and their Necron servants grew thin, Catan eventually devoured Catan, only until a few were left in the universe and they competed amongst themselves for a long age. Eventually, even the old ones who had once been defined by their patience and unstoppable will became desperate in the face of the Necron assault. They used their great scientific skills to genetically engineer intelligent beings with an even stronger psychic link to the warp, hoping to create servants with the capability of channeling psychic power to defend themselves. They nurtured many potential warrior species, among which are believed to be the earliest members of the Aldari species, and many other Xenos races, including the Rashan, the Neeb, and the Krork, and many others. Terran millennia passed as the Old One's creations and experiments finally bore fruit, even as the Catan and their Necron servants continued to extinguish life across the galaxy. Wow, okay. Was it the Old Ones who made the orcs? I think that they would have mentioned that if they were, but they did make the Eldari, so that makes sense. The Old Ones, psychically empowered servant species spread across the galaxy, battling the advanced Necron technology with the psychic power of their warp-spawned magic. Facing this new onslaught, the Catan's empire was shattered as the psychic forces of the Immaterium were anathema to soulless entities whose existence was wholly contained within their purely physical patterns of electromagnetic force. For all the destruction they could unleash, they were unable to stop the old ones, and the younger race's relentless advance across the stars. The remaining Catan, unified by this great threat for the first time in millions of Terran years, wow, sought a way to defeat the soul-fueled energies of the younger species. They initiated a great warding, a plan to forever defeat the psychic sorceries of the old ones by sealing off the material universe from the warp. A plan whose first fruits could once be found in the imperial fortress world of Kadia, in the form of the great pylons that littered the surface of that world in intricate networks and create the area of space-time stability near the Eye of Terror known as the Cadian Gate. Wow, a lot more information there again, and okay, so I get why the Catan got bored now, since it was millions of Terran years that they were doing this stuff, and with their godlike powers, it was only a matter of time until the Catan succeeded. But before their great work was complete, the seeds of destruction the old ones had planted millennia before brought about an unforeseen cataclysm. The growing pains and collective psychic flaws of the younger species threw the untapped, psychically reactive energies of the Immaterium into disorder. Oh, they threw the untapped reactive energies of the Immaterium into disorder. I did not know the Immaterium was so sensitive and that the warp gates, I mean, all this stuff. Jeez. War, pain, and destruction were mirrored in the bottomless depth of the Sea of Souls that was the warp. Okay, even more complicated warp stuff. Wow. The maelstrom of souls unleashed into the Immaterium by the carnage of the war in heaven coalesced in the previously formless energies of the warp. Older entities that had existed within the Immaterium transformed into terrifying psychic predators, tearing at the souls of vulnerable psychers as their own environment was torn apart and reforged into the realm of chaos. Oh, whoa, the realm of chaos? So did they create the realm of chaos, or did they just open a path to it? I didn't know that it was like, wow, okay. The denizens of the warp, stirred into a frenzy by the conflict in the Materium, clustered voraciously at the cracks between the Immaterium and the material universe, seeking new ways to enter the physical realm. The Old Ones brought forth new genetically engineered warrior species to defend their last strongholds, including the technology mimicking Jakero and the formidable green-skinned Krork, who were the ancestors of the present-day orcs. So that answers that question. But it was already too late. The Old One's intergalactic webway network was breached from the Immaterium and lost to them. Several of their warp gates were destroyed by their own hands to prevent the foul entities of the warp from spreading to uncorrupt worlds. And the Old Ones' greatest works and places of power were overrun by the horrors their own creation had unleashed. Wow. The most terrifying of these horrors were the enslavers, warp entities whose ability to dominate the minds of the younger species and create their own portals into the material realm using mutated, possessed psychers brought them forth in greater numbers. Wow, the enslavers. Interesting. I don't think I've ever heard of them, but I've probably seen them somewhere. For the Old Ones, this was the final disaster as the enslavers took control of their servants. The Pandora's box unleashed by the creation of the younger species finally scattered the last of the Old Ones and broke their power over the galaxy once and for all. Life had stood at the edge of an apocalypse during the war in heaven between the Old Ones and the Catan. Now, as the enslavers breached the Materium in epidemic proportions, the survivors looked doomed. Ultimately, beset by the implacable onset of the Catan and the calamitous, warp-spawned perils they had themselves mistakenly unleashed, the Old Ones were defeated, scattered, and finally destroyed. Whether the species went extinct or simply fled the galaxy to seek a new haven elsewhere is unknown. Wow, that's the end of the Old Ones. I want to know more about them, but I wonder if it's just all going to be Eldari myth that's covering who the Old Ones were, what they were. Super cool, though. All right, we're on the home stretch. We've just got a couple more sections to cover. This one is the Silent King's betrayal. Throughout the final stages of the war in heaven, Sarek bided his time, waiting for the moment in which the Catan would prove most vulnerable. Though the entire undying Necron species was now his to command, the Silent King could not hope to oppose the Catan at the height of their power. And even if he did and met with success, the Necrons would then have to finish the war in heaven against the Old Ones, and their increasingly potent allied warrior species alone. No, the Old Ones had to be completely and utterly defeated before the Catan could be brought to account for the horror they had wrought among the Necron tier. And so, when the Catan finally won their great war, their triumph was short-lived, with one hated enemy finally defeated and the other spent from hard-fought victory. The Silent King at last led the Necrons in revolt. In their arrogance, the Catan did not realize their danger until it was too late. The Necrons focused the unimaginable energies of the living universe into weapons, god-killing hypercannons devised by the finest cryptechs in the galaxy, too mighty for even the star gods to endure. Not even the great overlords of the Necron crown worlds well remember the battles against the star gods, for causality itself was damaged by the forces unleashed to dismember the Catan. And the Silent King was to remove the knowledge of the dreadful weapons employed from his warriors after the fact in fear of what might later be done with them. Alas, the Catan were immortal star spawn, part of the fundamental fabric of reality, and therefore nigh impossible to destroy. So was each Catan instead sundered into thousands of smaller and less powerful energetic fragments, each with the personality of the whole entity. Yet this outcome was sufficient to the Silent King's goals. Indeed, he had known the Catan's ultimate destruction to be impossible, and had drawn his plans accordingly. Each newborn Catan shard was bound with a multi-dimensional tesseract labyrinth, as trammeled and secured as the legendary Terran Jinn trapped in a bottle. I've never heard of that. The Terran Jinn trapped in a bottle? Is that a genie? Though the cost of victory was high, millions of Necron had been destroyed as a consequence of their rebellion, including all of the members of the Triarch, save the Silent King himself. Wow, okay. Silent King, guaranteed his rule even further, even though he didn't need it. He's got a button to press, on off. The Necrons were once more in command of their own destiny. Now that the Necrons are in command of their own destiny by taking out not only the old ones, but the Catan as well, pretty baller, what do they do now? Let's learn about that just after their victories. The Necrons had been vindicated in their pursuit only of science and control over the material realm, and certainly took pleasure in seeing the Old One's civilization collapse as a result of their own overindulgence of psychic power, and the end of the Catan's domination over their species. Yet, even with the defeat of the Old Ones and the Catan alike, the Silent King saw that the time of the Necrons in the galaxy was over, for the moment at least. They would allow the enslavers to take what was left of the intelligent life in the galaxy and let it become an interstellar wasteland. The Psyker swarm would then die away, and in time, the galaxy would evolve new life forms who would be less sophisticated and easier to dominate. In addition, the Necrons understood that the mantle of galactic dominion was soon to pass to the Aldari, one of the psychically potent species that had fought alongside the Old Ones throughout the war in the heavens, and had thus come to hate the Necrons and all their works with the burning passion that is the defining characteristic of that species. The Aldari had survived where the Old Ones had not, and the Necrons, weakened by their expenditure of lives and resources in overthrowing the rule of the Catan, could not stand against them. Yet the Silent King knew that the time of the Aldari would eventually pass, as it must pass for all those beings still cloaked in flesh. It would take millions of Terran years for the Eldari power to fade, but what mattered is that the Necrons would be there to take advantage of it. Wow, this is getting me more excited to learn about the Eldari. So it was that the Silent King ordered the remaining Necron cities to be transformed into great tomb complexes, threaded with stasis crypts. Let the Eldari shape the galaxy for a time. They were but ephemeral. Whilst the Necrons were undying and eternal, the Silent King's final command to his people was that they must sleep for the equivalent of 60 million standard years, but awake ready to rebuild all that they had lost, to restore the Necron dynasties to their former glory. This was the Silent King's final order, and as the last tomb world sealed its subterranean vaults, Tsarek destroyed the engrammatic command protocols by which he had controlled his people for so long. Really? For he had failed them utterly. Without a backward glance, Tsarek, the last of the Silent Kings of the Triarch, took ships into the starless void of intergalactic space, there to find whatever measure of solace or penance he could. Well, that's a man move by Tsarek. He did fail his people. He got all their souls eaten. Meanwhile, eons passed and the Necrons slept on, their machine slaves and constructs guarding them while they slept on tomb worlds that had been purged of all life to keep the enslavers from their door. This plan worked with an amazing degree of success until the Necrons were awakened by the forces of Imperium of Man. Oh wow. Until the Necrons were awakened by the forces of the Imperium of Man in the 41st millennia to plague the galaxy once more. So the Imperium of Man, woke them up from their nap. So that's why they're all pissy. They discovered a new and unexpected age of interstellar civilization and war, much like the one they had left behind 60 million standard years before. The galaxy was blossoming with life once more, but is still overrun with latent psychers and worshippers of the infernal chaos warp energies, first unleashed during the War in Heaven. It will take time and a great many machinations for the Necron dynasties to regain their rightful place as the rulers of the galaxy. The agents of chaos must be overthrown. The dangerous Aldari, inheritors of the Old One's mantle, eliminated. Humanity subjugated. And the great work cutting off the material universe from the warp completed before a new age of Necron dominion can truly begin. But the Necrons are ageless and undying, their technology still unmatched by any younger star-facing species, and time is always on their side. Alright, so that was great. I still have questions though. I am curious, how early did the Imperium of Man wake up some of these Necron? Is it like, real close to that 60 million mark? Or is it, you still got another million years until everyone awakes? But for now, just the disturbed ones are getting woken up. Maybe the Necron that are awake now are waking others up. Maybe they wouldn't sabotage their own mission like that. I don't know. There's a lot more to cover, but this was a really cool in-depth analysis of the Necron. And it got me a lot more hyped about the Aldari. Yeah, I think that I will cover the Aldari next. Hope you guys enjoyed it. Have a good one.